I woke up to find my $78,000 boat missing. At first, I thought I must be dreaming. My brain tried to piece it together. I had moored that boat at my private dock just last night. I had double-checked the ropes, made sure the lines were secure, even switched on the small security light that flickered around midnight. Yet here I was, barefoot, on a cold plank of wood, staring out at a patch of empty water where my Regal LS4 used to be. That boat was my pride and joy, the embodiment of everything I'd worked for since my 20s. I felt my stomach tighten with a jolt of panic. No matter how hard I blinked, the reality didn't change. The boat was gone, as though snatched by invisible thieves who vanished into the early morning mist. I stood there, running my hands through my hair, wondering who the culprit could be. The neighborhood was usually so peaceful that I rarely locked my back gate, foolish as that might sound. Break-ins were almost unheard of in Willow Bend Shores, a place with tastefully designed homes and meticulously trimmed lawns. Our HOA enforced standards that made certain everything always looked pristine, to the point of near sterility. I had never suspected a serious crime would happen on these manicured streets, let alone at my house. As I walked back inside to grab my phone, my mind raced with a chaotic swirl of questions. Had someone towed the boat away under cover of darkness? Could it have drifted off because of a freak accident with the ropes? Had I been targeted for some reason I couldn't yet fathom? I called the local police, who arrived faster than expected. A young officer named Carlisle stepped out, wearing a bored expression that suggested he was used to dealing with minor neighborhood disputes. He asked me some routine questions, glanced at the empty dock, and fiddled with his notepad. Painfully then, as I tried to explain why I believed this was a theft, I heard a voice call out from behind us in that maddeningly cheerful tone. That boat was impounded for violation of our watercraft guidelines. It's all in the HOA charter. I turned and saw Karen Langley, president of the Willow Bend Shores Homeowners Association, standing at the edge of my lawn with a smug smile. She was short, early 50s, sporting that distinctive helmet of blonde hair sprayed into place, wearing a pastel business suit at 7 in the morning. Everything about her exuded a sense of control. Her gaze flicked to my bare feet, then to the policeman, then back to me, as though I was a delinquent teenager she had just caught sneaking out after curfew. I felt my pulse race. I said I'd never heard of any rule that allowed the HOA to confiscate personal property. Karen smirked, holding out a thick binder stuffed with papers. She told Officer Carlisle that I had repeatedly failed to comply with an official notice requiring boats over a certain length to be relocated to an off-site facility. She flicked her eyes to me and gave a theatrical sigh, as though this were all so tedious. She explained that the boat was being kept in a secure location, pending a hearing. I was speechless. I demanded more details, but Karen just tisked me, shaking her head. The officer flipped through the documents she provided, then returned them to her without much scrutiny. For him, it looked like a civil dispute. He shrugged at me, said he couldn't get involved if the HOA had the lawful right to impound something that supposedly violated their rules, and he left soon after, politely suggesting I call a lawyer if I had further complaints. Karen stayed for a moment longer, making sure to lock eyes with me as she said, "Next time, read the fine print." I realized then that my dispute was not with petty thieves. It was with the HOA itself, or, more accurately, with Karen, who seemingly believed she was the queen of Willow Bend Shores. My relief at the boat not being snatched by unknown criminals immediately turned into a seething fury. What gave her the right to take my property? Where exactly had she put it? Could she really hide behind these so-called HOA regulations? Confusion mingled with anger as I followed her out to the street, demanding she tell me where the boat was. She offered a curt smile, explained that all would be revealed at the next board meeting, 3 weeks away. and suggested I brush up on the guidelines in the meantime. By the time she climbed into her spotless white SUV and drove off, I felt an urgent need to get to the bottom of this. I'd put a chunk of my savings into that boat, and there was no way I'd let it become a pawn in her manipulations. I went back inside, still in my pajamas, my feet leaving wet footprints across the tile. I fired up my laptop and opened the official Willow Bend Shores website, scanning every line of the HOA bylaws I could find. My eyes glazed over after a while because the text was filled with legalese. There were certainly sections discussing permissible boat sizes and storage protocols, though everything seemed vague about enforcement. I saw nothing about the HOA having the right to seize personal property. Yet I knew from the smug look on Karen's face that she'd found some twisted interpretation of those rules, or forged an amendment, or browbeaten the board into passing a hidden clause. None of it made sense. Willow Bend Shores had a long, scenic lake that people moved here specifically to enjoy. Several neighbors had small boats or kayaks. Mine was a bit larger, sure, but that hardly seemed enough reason to take it away so brazenly. I sipped coffee, my frustration mounting, and I realized that if I wanted any hope of retrieving my boat, I needed to gather more information. I texted a friend who had once been on an HOA board in a different neighborhood, asking if he'd ever heard of such a thing as impounding. He responded with a string of laughing emojis, saying, "No way can an HOA do that. They can fine you, but not physically take your stuff." I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Karen was bluffing, or maybe she had crossed a line she shouldn't have. Then I read the text again. Sometimes HOAs get away with things not because they have the right, but because nobody challenges them effectively. A sinking feeling told me this might become a drawn-out battle. My phone buzzed with another message from my friend. "Watch your back," he wrote. "Some of those HOA presidents get power-hungry. Don't let her intimidate you." By mid-morning, I decided to talk to some of the neighbors who had lived here longer than I had. I started with the house next door, belonging to an older couple named the Mullers. They were friendly enough to wave from time to time, though we hadn't had a real conversation. I found them in their front garden, watering rose bushes. When I asked if they knew about the boat rule, they exchanged a nervous glance. Then Mrs. Muller spoke in a cautious tone. "You're talking about Karen, aren't you? She's known for pulling stunts. Be careful." I pressed them for specifics, and they told me that a few years back another family had installed a temporary above-ground pool without explicit HOA approval. Karen had showed up with some kind of cease and desist letter, threatened to fine them $100 a day, and eventually forced them to dismantle the entire thing. The Mullers shrugged, as if to say that's just how things worked around here. People mostly avoided confrontation to keep the peace. I thanked them, but I walked away feeling unsettled. It seemed everyone in Willow Bend Shores was aware of Karen's heavy-handed tactics, yet nobody dared to stand up to her. I marched back across my driveway, phone in hand, intending to call a lawyer. Then I remembered that lawyers cost money, a lot of money. My finances had already taken a hit when I purchased the boat. Maybe I should collect more evidence first. I pulled up a local community forum online, typed in the name of our HOA, and scrolled through the posts. As expected, many people complained about small fines or violation notices, but I saw nothing about property being confiscated. I posted a new thread. Can the HOA actually take your boat from your private dock? Within minutes, I got a few comments from residents of other neighborhoods telling me that definitely wasn't legal, but HOAs sometimes did questionable things. One person recommended that I check the county property records to see if Karen had any history of litigation, or if the HOA had previously gone after people's vehicles. The more I dug, the more I uncovered a swirl of half-rumors about Karen controlling the board with an iron fist, forging meeting minutes, passing emergency resolutions with no notice. Nothing I found was conclusive, but it hinted that I wasn't the first to be singled out. Perhaps I was just the first to be singled out for something so large and valuable that it sparked outrage. I spent most of the afternoon calling various offices, City Hall, the county clerk, even the local environmental board, asking if the HOA had filed any official complaint about my boat that would justify their taking it away. I was met with confusion or ignorance. None of those offices had any record. Late in the day, a city clerk named Andrea suggested I try searching for lien documentation, since sometimes HOAs put liens on properties for non-payment, but that wouldn't justify physically seizing my boat, she said. She recommended I consult a property rights attorney. I hung up, frustrated, feeling like I was running in circles. Then my phone rang. It was a blocked number. I hesitated, then picked up. A woman's voice whispered, "Watch yourself if you go poking around the HOA's finances. I tried that once. Karen made my life miserable." Before I could ask who she was, the line clicked dead. My heart thudded. Were people watching me? Who had given that tip? That night, I lay awake with the lights off, listening for any strange noises in the backyard. I wondered if Karen might send someone to rummage around, or even to vandalize my property, to warn me away from challenging her. My mind conjured up paranoid scenarios. Then I forced myself to think logically. She already had my boat, so what more could she do? She was probably content to hold it hostage until I caved in, or tried to fight her in some expensive legal proceeding. That made me grit my teeth. I was never someone who enjoyed conflict, but I also wasn't the type to roll over when someone crossed a line. And this was a big line to cross. My father always taught me that if you let bullies have their way once, they never stop. So I decided, come morning, I'd push back as best I could. I woke early and wrote an email to the HOA board, politely but firmly requesting an immediate explanation of how, under what authority, and on whose orders my property had been seized. I copied all the board members listed on the HOA website, about 7 individuals, including Karen. I ended the note by stating that if the boat was not returned within 48 hours, I would pursue legal remedies. I clicked send and felt a surge of adrenaline, half expecting Karen to reply with some snide remark. But the morning passed in silence. No email, no call, no knock on the door from an HOA representative. I decided to attend an informal coffee meetup held every Wednesday at the community center to see if I could talk to any board members in person. I had never gone to these events before because I assumed they were for retirees who had lots of free time. But that morning, I marched in, heart pounding, to see if I could corner them. The crowd was mostly older folks, sipping coffee, nibbling on pastries, chatting about grandchildren and gardening. I spotted Karen near a table, holding court with a group of people nodding along as she spoke. My eyes locked on her. She spotted me, and her lips curved into a condescending little smile. I walked over, determined not to make a scene, but also not to show fear. "Karen," I said calmly, "I need to know where my boat is. I sent an email to the board. Did you see it?" She gave a dismissive wave. "It's an internal matter. The board is reviewing the situation." I tried to press further, but she fixed me with that icy stare, and I saw the other board members shift uncomfortably. One of them, a tall man named Brent, cleared his throat and said, "We'll respond to your inquiry soon. We appreciate your patience." Karen promptly changed the subject to next month's landscaping schedule, ignoring me as if I were invisible. A few minutes later, feeling deflated, I left the community center. It was obvious they wouldn't talk in a public setting. Perhaps they were worried I might record them or that some other neighbor might overhear. As I headed out to the parking lot, a small, mousy, haled woman scurried up to me. She introduced herself as Leslie, the HOA's administrative assistant. Though not an official board member, she whispered that she didn't agree with what Karen was doing, but she was afraid of losing her job if she spoke up. She said something cryptic about how the board had passed an emergency resolution late one night, with only 4 members present, effectively granting the HOA power to remove any boat deemed hazardous to the environment. Then she looked around, terrified someone might overhear, and scuttled back inside. I stared after her, heart pounding. Hazardous to the environment? My boat had a modern, low-emission engine, and I always made sure never to discharge any pollutants into the lake. This was a flimsy cover story, a convenient excuse to take what they wanted. The question was, why? A few days passed. I spent them scouring every relevant state statute I could find online, making phone calls to legal hotlines, even posting a reward on the local forum for anyone who could provide information about the whereabouts of my boat. No leads emerged. Meanwhile, Karen's presence loomed everywhere. I'd see her SUV roll past my house in the morning, slow down slightly, then continue on. A neighbor told me Karen had once forced an elderly resident to remove a handmade wooden porch swing because it didn't meet aesthetic standards. Another neighbor mentioned the rumor that Karen was trying to buy properties on the cheap, maybe to sell them off to a developer. The more I heard, the more I felt she was playing a long game, using the HOA as a tool of intimidation to reshape the neighborhood into something she could profit from. Late on the 5th day since my boat vanished, I received an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper that read, "Look up the land records for Pineview Marsh. Connect the dots. Don't mention my name." It felt like I had stumbled into a cheap spy thriller. Pineview Marsh was a small wetland area adjacent to the lake, protected by local environmental laws. Intrigued, I pulled up the county's online property database. After some digging, I discovered that a corporate entity named Pineview Investments had purchased a significant chunk of that wetland, apparently planning to develop it into a recreational facility. The address on file led me to a P.O. box in another state. My gut told me that Karen was involved. Perhaps she was forging rules to drive people away from the lakeshore, planning eventually to connect the property with a new development. It was all speculation on my part, but I felt the puzzle pieces slowly clicking into place. A desire to control the community, angle for personal gain, and maybe earn kickbacks from developers in the process. My boat might simply have been the first large-scale victim of this plan. I was about to close my laptop when a chat message popped up on the forum. It was from a user with a handle I didn't recognize. "I know where your boat is." My heart pounded. I typed back a flurry of questions. The user responded with an address on the far side of Willow Bend Shores, near a disused launch area. They claimed the HOA towed my boat there, hidden behind a chain-link fence with a no trespassing sign. They wouldn't say how they had found this out, only that I should be careful. I waited until dusk, hopped in my truck, and drove across the neighborhood. The sun was setting, painting the sky in tangerine hues. The address took me to an isolated spot near the lake's inlet. Sure enough, there was a fenced lot. Beyond the fence, in the dim light, I could make out the shape of at least 2 boats, one of which seemed to be mine, covered in a tarp. My breath caught in my throat. I felt both relief and a surge of anger. There it was, presumably just sitting there for days while I was forced to scramble for answers. I parked a short distance away, peered around for any cameras or guards. The place looked deserted. My first instinct was to jump the fence and reclaim my property, but logic held me back. Karen was probably hoping I'd do something rash so she could slap me with a trespassing suit. Instead, I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture the lot, the fence, the sign, and the shape of my Regal. This was physical evidence that the HOA had physically moved my boat, effectively stealing it. On the drive home, I considered calling the police again, but my last experience left me skeptical that it would help. I decided to gather all I had: the suspicious notes, the cryptic forum messages, the photos, the rumored Pineview Marsh connections, and see if I could put together a more compelling case. My boat was a tangible, high-value asset. If the HOA had moved it without any legal backing, that was not just an HOA rule violation, it was criminal. I sensed Karen was banking on her ability to confuse local law enforcement with complicated. The next morning, I went to the sheriff's department with my folder of evidence. At the front desk, a deputy seemed unimpressed by my story, but when I insisted that I had photographic proof, he directed me to speak with Detective Ward, an older officer with a kind face and a tired demeanor. Ward listened carefully as I laid out the timeline. My boat was moored on my property. Karen served me with questionable notices. The boat disappeared, and I found it locked away in a fenced lot. He frowned at the photos, especially the ones showing a second boat under a tarp. "You say there may be more vessels?" he asked, leaning forward. I nodded, telling him I had heard rumors of other residents who faced similar intimidation. He sighed, then explained that in his experience, HOA conflicts usually boiled down to civil disputes, but physically taking someone's boat sounded serious, so he'd look into it. He cautioned that if the HOA claimed I was in violation of some covenant, he'd need to see what legal basis they were citing. "But if it's a sham, we can open a criminal investigation," he said, his voice trailing off. I thanked him, feeling guarded hope. I returned home, feeling drained. My phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "Don't go to the cops, you'll make it worse for everyone." My anger flared. This was crossing the line into outright intimidation. I typed back, "Who is this?" There was no response. I didn't recognize the number, but the tone was clear. Karen and her allies might have deep pockets and enough influence to scare other homeowners, but they weren't scaring me. I doubled down on my search for more proof. Something that could tie Karen to Pineview Investments or show a direct financial motive. If I could establish that she was profiting from terrorizing people out of the neighborhood, maybe the authorities would act faster. I also decided to contact an environmental watchdog group that had a presence in the area, to see if they knew anything about Pineview Marsh. The group's director, a woman named Eileen, spoke with me at length and said they'd been monitoring suspicious developments around the wetlands, suspecting backroom deals. She invited me to meet and compare notes. The following day, I drove out to a local cafe where Eileen was waiting, a stack of documents spread across her table. She told me about seeing Karen at several county commission meetings, always pushing for redevelopment of underutilized lakeshore, framing it as a boon to tourism. "But," Eileen said, "it's obvious the real goal is to build on protected land for profit." She showed me meeting minutes where Karen sang the praises of new facilities while conveniently glossing over the environmental impact. Eileen also believed that Karen was forging alliances with local officials who might receive some benefit in exchange for turning a blind eye. We flipped through pages of budget allocations, land surveys, and permit requests. I realized that what had happened to me, my boat being seized, was just a small part of a bigger puzzle. Karen likely wanted to discourage owners of larger vessels from mooring at the lake, possibly to manipulate data about boat traffic or water conditions, making it easier to classify the area as underserved and ripe for development. It was twisted logic, but it fit the pattern. As I drove home that evening, my thoughts churned. Who else in Willow Bend Shores had faced the brunt of Karen's tactics and might be willing to speak up? I decided to approach a resident named Martin, who lived a few doors down, someone I'd heard complaining about unfair fines. Martin was a straightforward guy, around my age, who worked in landscaping. When I explained what had happened to my boat, he rolled his eyes and said, "Of course, she's been itching to push you out. She wants to label you a problem, so you'll either pay her off or leave." He confided that Karen had threatened to fine him for parking his work truck in his driveway, something the rules allegedly allowed as long as it was less than 24 hours. But she reinterpreted the guidelines, demanded he pay hundreds in penalties, and only backed off when he threatened to sue. Martin told me that many folks in the neighborhood cowered rather than fight. We all thought the best approach was to keep our heads down. "Sorry you got singled out. I guess your boat was the spark she needed." We traded stories for over an hour, culminating in Martin promising to help me gather more testimonies. He introduced me to a small group of residents who had quietly formed a sort of anti-Karen coalition, though they did so in private. They recounted tales of how Karen twisted rules, brought false charges, used fines as leverage, and in some cases, forced people to put their houses on the market. A few homes had been snapped up below value, possibly by shell companies or individuals connected to Karen. Listening to them, I realized we were dealing with a coordinated scheme. Each person had endured what felt like petty tyranny, but in aggregate, it painted a picture of systematic abuse. We compiled our notes, intent on taking them to the authorities. Yet some group members worried that if we moved too publicly, Karen would escalate. That tension weighed on us. However, with my boat as physical evidence of a blatant seizure, we had a strong rallying point. Detective Ward called me the next week to say he'd visited the fenced lot. The sign on the gate read, "Under HOA maintenance," but he found no official record sanctioning it for storage. He saw the boats under tarps. When he confronted the guard on duty, apparently a part-time security contractor who refused to give his name, he was told that only Karen had the keys and the passcode to the locked gate. Ward asked for a formal statement from her, but she claimed the property belonged to a partner organization. It was a maze of red tape, but Ward sounded more determined than bored now. He suggested that if the matter extended beyond local jurisdiction, we might need to contact the county attorney or even the state's attorney general. I offered him the new information I'd gathered about Pineview Marsh, and he said he'd look into it. Days melted into weeks. Meanwhile, I kept getting violation notices from the HOA for trivial nonsense. My hedges were an inch too tall, my porch light was too bright, my recycling bin was placed incorrectly. Each letter had the same cold, formal signature from Karen. I filed them away, sure they'd serve as evidence of harassment. Then, unexpectedly, I received a cease and desist letter from an attorney claiming to represent the HOA. Accusing me of slander, demanding I remove defamatory posts from the community forum, and threatening litigation if I continued to harass board members. I read it over 3 times, feeling nauseous. I had simply asked about the whereabouts of my boat. How was that defamation? My frustration turned into a cold resolve. I wasn't going to be bullied by legal threats. If Karen wanted a fight, I'd give her one. At about this time, the break I needed arrived in the form of an anonymous tip. A letter slipped under my door at night contained scanned copies of internal HOA emails, presumably hacked or leaked by someone with access. The emails showed how Karen orchestrated an after-meals board meeting attended only by her loyal allies. They hammered out the emergency resolution, claiming environmental hazards from power boats exceeding 20 feet in length. The thread included a message from Karen bragging that she would make an example out of me. It also hinted at a land deal with Pineview Investments. I swallowed hard, scanning the lines, seeing how coldly she wrote about driving out residents who opposed her. Now I had digital proof of her wrongdoing. A direct link between the boat seizure and her larger plan. Heart pounding, I printed everything and hurried to show Detective Ward and the small group of neighbors who had formed the coalition. This was the smoking gun. Within days, the local media got wind of it. A small-town reporter from our county press approached me, having somehow learned about the stolen boat fiasco and the leaked emails. I hesitated to talk at first, but the neighbors in our coalition convinced me that shining a public spotlight on Karen's manipulative tactics might force the authorities to act faster, so I told my story to the reporter, on the condition that other neighbors' identities remain confidential for the time being. The reporter interviewed me, photographed the fenced lot from a distance, and tried to get a quote from Karen. She refused, calling it a fabrication. Then, that weekend, an article ran on the front page of our local paper. HOA president accused of boat theft, alleged fraud linked to wetland development. It was explosive by small-town standards. Karen must have been furious. By Monday, my email was flooded with messages, some from local residents cheering me on, others from random trolls telling me I should have followed the rules. The tension in Willow Bend Shores was palpable. Karen retaliated by issuing a statement on the HOA website, claiming that I was a disgruntled homeowner ignoring environmental regulations, that the board had acted in the best interest of the community, and that they intended to file formal charges against me for damage to HOA property. The latter accusation was new and bizarre. I suspected she was grasping at straws. Then, 2 days later, the real bomb dropped. FBI agents showed up at the HOA office in the early morning. Residents who passed by saw men in suits carting out boxes of documents, laptops, and servers. Word spread quickly. I nearly dropped my mug when a friend called to say he saw federal agents rummaging around inside the building. Soon, black SUVs rolled up to Karen's house, and agents went in with a search warrant. The reason for the FBI's involvement turned out to be bigger than local corruption. Pineview Investments had apparently been flagged in a multi-state investigation for illegal land deals. The feds were building a case against them for bribery, money laundering, and environmental crimes. Karen's partnership with them placed her right in the crosshairs. That same afternoon, a flurry of law enforcement vehicles converged on the fenced lot where my boat was stored, presumably to inventory all the assets. I rushed down there, snapping pictures from across the street, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I had never intended to provoke a federal investigation, I just wanted my boat back. But if Karen's downfall meant exposing a broader scheme, so be it. The next 48 hours were a blur. The FBI apparently discovered incriminating financial records at both the HOA office and Karen's home. Evidence of bribes, secret land transactions, wire transfers. They uncovered proof that Karen manipulated HOA rules to drive out certain homeowners, forcing cheap sales of properties that Pineview Investments then snapped up. My boat seizure was just the tip of the iceberg, the example that ignited public scrutiny. Late in the day, I heard from Detective Ward that Karen had been taken into custody under suspicion of fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit environmental violations. The local news station quickly picked it up, featuring footage of agents escorting Karen into a government vehicle. Seeing her that way felt surreal, especially when I recalled how just days earlier she was prancing around the neighborhood with her binder of regulations. Word spread that the FBI also seized Karen's own boat, a fancy, newly purchased vessel she kept hidden at a private marina outside Willow Bend Shores. The irony was too sweet. She had stolen my boat with bogus claims, only to have the feds take hers for reasons well grounded in criminal charges. Neighbors whispered about it in hushed, incredulous tones. Can you believe it? She took his boat, now the FBI took hers. Indeed, the phrase became a sort of local catchline, repeated with glee by people who had spent years living under her tyranny. Even those who had once been neutral about Karen found themselves chuckling at the swift twist of fate. Meanwhile, the newly revealed documents showed that Karen had personally approved the storage site where she stashed my Regal, along with other seized items from unsuspecting residents. The communal sense of vindication was overwhelming. Amid this unfolding drama, I finally got the official green light to retrieve my boat from that fenced lot. With an agent and a county deputy present, I unlocked the chain and pulled back the tarp. There she was, my LS4, looking a bit dusty but otherwise fine. I checked for damage, found none, and exhaled a deep breath of relief. Feeling that steering wheel under my hands again, I couldn't help but marvel at how this single piece of property had become a lightning rod for an entire corruption scandal. The deputy helped me hitch it to my truck, and I brought it home. By dusk, I had my boat tied securely at my own dock once more. Standing there listening to the gentle lap of water against the hull, it felt like reclaiming more than just an object. It felt like reclaiming my dignity, my right to live here without fear. The aftermath was chaotic. The HOA board resigned in disgrace, except for a couple of members who insisted they had no idea what Karen was doing. The county quickly appointed an interim receiver to handle the HOA's affairs until a proper election could be held. Many residents seemed stunned by the revelations. Some had innocently believed Karen's claims that everything she did was for the good of the community. Others suspected wrongdoing for years, but felt powerless to oppose her. A swirl of lawsuits began taking shape. People who had been fined or forced to modify their homes demanded restitution, while those who had sold properties at reduced prices threatened to sue for damages. Over the next few weeks, the entire neighborhood went through a reckoning, unearthing Karen's multi-layered deceit. As for me, I found myself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Neighbors started calling me a hero or a whistleblower. I shrugged off the labels, explaining that all I did was stand up for my boat. But deep down, I felt a sense of satisfaction that my stubborn resolve had led to the exposure of a much larger scam. The local paper ran a follow-up story. HOA president scheme dismantled by residents' persistence. 5 Clues Given squad again a rundown of what Detective Ward I knew about the 911 call that came in the prior day. Now, this is another spot where talking about the detectives builds up your spite. The FBI investigation rolled on, eventually entangling Pineview Investments in a grander case of environmental violations and bribery. Karen's personal finances were scrutinized, revealing that she'd received undisclosed sums for pushing certain zoning changes. Meanwhile, Willow Bend Shores embarked on a slow, difficult path to reform. The interim HOA receiver held public forums where residents could express grievances and propose changes to the bylaws. We formed a committee to review every clause that Karen had railroaded through the board, aiming to restore fairness and transparency. People seemed more engaged than ever, determined not to let one autocrat seize power again. One evening, not long after the FBI raids, I took my boat out for a leisurely ride around the lake. It was early autumn, the sky tinted with the faint gold of the setting sun. As I floated on the calm waters, I thought about how close I'd come to simply accepting Karen's intimidation or giving in to her fines or walking away from the fight. Had I done that, she might still be ruling the neighborhood. Unstoppable, continuing her shady dealing. That thought made me shiver. Instead, the lake felt like a place of freedom again, untainted by her petty dictates. A sense of peace washed over me, and I realized I had fallen in love with Willow Bend Shores for its scenic charm, but I'd grown to appreciate it more for the community of people who had, in their own ways, found the courage to unite against wrongdoing. As the weeks turned into months, the legal process against Karen moved forward. She eventually made a plea deal, admitting partial guilt in exchange for revealing the identities of other collaborators. The local newspapers described how she turned over bank statements, naming city officials who had quietly supported her, all of it reinforcing that my boat was just one small part of a vast tapestry of corruption. Hearing that validated my initial gut feeling that none of this was just about a boat or about a noise violation. It was about greed, control, and a disregard for both the environment and the rights of homeowners. Her dramatic downfall became a cautionary tale throughout the county. HOA abuse of power had rarely been so blatant or so intricately tied to a bigger scandal. An unexpected but welcome outcome was the chance to truly connect with neighbors I'd barely spoken to before. Now that Karen's oppressive aura was lifted, we started holding monthly gatherings by the lake. People brought food, told stories, and laughed about how foolish we'd been to let one person dominate so thoroughly. Martin taught me some lawn care tricks, helping me re-landscape my front yard so that I wouldn't have to worry about future Eileen from the environmental group spoke at one of our gatherings, explaining ways we could support the local ecosystem and ensure that any new developments around Willow Bend Shores were sustainable and ethical. She was optimistic that, with the corruption exposed, the wetland might remain protected after all. We felt a collective sense of responsibility to preserve what made our neighborhood special, so that no other manipulator could warp it again for their gain. From time to time, I reflected on the strange path it took to get here. I remembered waking up that chilly morning to an empty dock, the horror of thinking my boat was stolen, then the disbelief when I learned it was the HOA that had taken it. I could still picture Karen's smug grin that first day, how she insisted she had every right, how the officer walked away, leaving me feeling powerless. And now, ironically, she was the one stripped of power. Her own boat was confiscated by federal agents, an almost poetic closure to the entire debacle. I didn't rejoice in her personal misery, but I did feel relief that she could no longer harm anyone else in Willow Bend Shores. Sometimes justice has a funny way of coming full circle. Long after the dust settled, new neighbors began moving in, attracted by the lake's beauty and the newly reformed HOA that promised fairness rather than authoritarianism. They heard rumors about the time the HOA president stole a boat and ended up in federal prison, and they laughed, believing it was an urban legend exaggerated for effect. But whenever I bumped into them, I'd just smile and say, "That story is mostly true, trust me. You wouldn't believe half the details if you weren't here to see them." And they'd look at me, curious, maybe a little disbelieving, never quite realizing how close Willow Bend Shores came to being a stepping stone for a corrupt land development empire. In the end, the real moral of the story was about standing up for yourself when something important is on the line. For me, that was my boat, a hard-earned reward that symbolized years of work and a dream of peaceful weekends on the water. For others, it might be their home, their family, their sense of belonging. Karen picked the wrong person to bully because I didn't back down, and I found allies. People who had their own reasons to fight once they saw a spark. Even that local detective and the national agencies played roles I never anticipated. Without everyone stepping up, Karen might have kept her empire hidden. The best part is that once the truth emerged, it was unstoppable. Justice can be delayed, but often arrives in the end. Ironically, Karen's downfall was swift once the cracks appeared. Now I continue to take my boat out on the lake, sometimes with friends or neighbors who want to fish or just drift under the sun. We look at the cypress trees along the shoreline and notice new signs proclaiming the wetland is a protected habitat. Sometimes we joke about installing a plaque that says, "In memory of the stolen boat that freed Willow Bend Shores," but we never quite do it. It's enough to know we endured a storm and came out better for it, stronger, and more appreciative of the harmony that can exist in a community when fear no longer reigns. Occasionally, I'll glance at the dock and remember that chilling moment I realized the boat was gone. But instead of bitterness, I feel gratitude, because if Karen hadn't taken my boat, maybe none of us would have discovered how deep her corruption ran, and we'd still be tiptoeing around, wondering what petty rule might drop next. Life moves on with surprising normalcy after such upheaval. The fresh breeze, the shimmering water, and the quiet hum of an outboard motor are my weekly reminders that freedom often depends on challenging the powers that try to take it away. Willow Bend Shores isn't perfect, but it's ours, and no single tyrant, no matter how cunning, can ever hold an entire community hostage once the people refuse to tolerate it. So that's how I tell the story. That's how I explain the morning I woke up to a missing boat, followed by the day the FBI rolled in to turn Karen's world upside down. 2 days is all it took for her scheme to unravel once I began pulling at the threads. The pace of justice can be slow or fast, but in those moments it moved. People used to scoff at the idea of an HOA president wielding too much power, but now they see a petty ruler can be as dangerous as any politician if left unchecked. We learned to check her, and in doing so we saved our neighborhood from a far darker fate than we ever imagined. Whenever a new neighbor asks for the short version, I just say, HOA Karen stole my boat. 2 days later, the FBI took hers. It's the simplest summary, yet it barely scratches the surface of all the twists, anxieties, and moments of frantic investigation. In truth, the real story is about how a community overcame fear, how shining a light on hidden corruption revealed not just one stolen boat, but an entire system of greed. But that quick punchline grabs their attention, and if they're curious enough to hear the extended tale, I'll invite them over for a cold drink, show them the spot where the boat once went missing, and walk them through how close we came to losing everything. We always end up toasting the lake, the quiet waters lapping at the shore, a place of unexpected battles and ultimate redemption. And in those ripples, I see reflection upon reflection, a reminder that sometimes it takes losing what you love to realize how far you're willing to go to protect it.